listeners, and welcome to CC World, a podcast by Global Spark, where we foster conversations on the world of social impact, global problem solving, and multidisciplinary collaboration. I'm your host and podcast co-producer, Hugh Wen, and I'm a fourth-year undergraduate student at the University of Toronto studying peace, conflict, and justice, and contemporary Asian studies. Today, I'm very excited to be having a conversation with Vera Belazelkoska, Director of Programs at Ulula. LULA is a Toronto-based company which supports responsible and transparent business practices around the world through software and data analytics. LULA collaborates with companies, nonprofits, and governments to source accurate and timely insights from workers and communities via mobile phones and use innovative dashboards to provide data analytics that helps their clients identify human rights abuses in their supply chains and inform actionable improvements. Thanks so much for joining us, Vera.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So to start off, a lot of our listeners are students and those interested in pursuing a career path in the area of social impact. And so I'm really interested to know kind of what your path in this field was and how your educational background and previous experiences led you to become part of Ulula.
Yeah, I'd be happy to share. So my academic background is in political science and economics. I was a double major when I studied in university. And from both perspectives of political science and economics, I always was interested in the aspect of international development and topics of poverty alleviation and innovation, and especially social innovation and human-centered design approaches to empowering people to make the change in their own communities. I really was quite passionate about less technocratic approaches and more grassroots community-led approaches to development, which led me to study abroad quite a lot. I spent more than half of my time in university in the Global South. And through that experience, I realized that I really want to get as much field work in the space as possible, which led me to a couple of years living and working in different sectors in parts of Asia and South America. But then after various years in the nonprofit sector, I was realizing that, with an economics degree and an interest in global trade, I was curious to venture into how can corporations do better, because I kept finding that a lot of the nonprofit work that I was involved with seemed at times to be more of a band-aid to a bigger socioeconomic challenge. And as a foreigner in Argentina or Thailand, there's only so much that I can and should contribute. At some point, I realized that, there's probably a better path for me in understanding how corporations in parts of Europe or North America can be held more accountable for the type of impact that they have in countries where they operate. So I had never lived in Canada, but I had applied and was accepted as a permanent resident. So I decided to come to Canada and study. I got my master's in political economy of international development. And then, after a couple of years of more nonprofit work, I was even more motivated and interested in how I can work on initiatives of transparency and accountability within global business and trade. And that's when I stumbled upon the co-founders of Ulula when they were just starting out. And it just seemed like a very natural fit, especially because I was working a lot in monitoring and evaluation in different organizations. For example, I worked in Namibia during my school year abroad as a monitoring and evaluation analyst, looking at microfinancing programs. Or I also worked on data collection for a cooperative in Nicaragua, over 12 years ago now. And so I was always interested in data and collecting data and talking to people and collecting their feedback and insights. And having done that, jumping on chicken buses and going far away to where some of the entrepreneurs were living in Nicaragua, I wondered, there's a better way. People have phones, there's ways for us to keep in touch with people without having to do that legwork. Of course, it's important to continue to have face-to-face interactions, but I already was thinking about and very, inspired by the way that different organizations have been using technology to connect to their key stakeholders. So when I met the two co-founders, I was quite keen, and I had already felt the need for a technology like this. So I really sat in the intersection of, working with global trade and trying to support organizations and corporations connect to their key stakeholders, but then also the other side of how do we collect better data, more frequent data, and connect with people that are most impacted by businesses in order to help channel that information to key decision makers. So it was a very kind of a serendipitous landing, I would say.
That's awesome to hear. Yeah, I feel like in this field, because there's so many different ways to make impact, sometimes the opportunities that come are quite serendipitous. But something about what you said actually really caught my attention, which is that, as a foreigner who is working in the field in different countries in the global south, you witness a lot of problems, but also there are only so many ways in which you should and in which you can act. So I'm kind of curious, in which sort of situations did you encounter that made you feel like there was a different path that you could act in, or where there was a limitation for you specifically as the actor to make that difference?
Yeah, I think especially in the field of microfinancing and financial opportunities to what they would call the people at the bottom of the pyramid, that was very much a topic in a sector I was interested in. I had studied and I'd interned in even when I was in school. But I think the more that I engaged in that sector, the more I also kept understanding that, we are potentially imposing a particular, economic, more capitalist model on people who have a different way of working and lending money and using money and borrowing money. So I started to get a little bit more skeptical about that aspect of introducing financial inclusivity in communities, even though, of course, as from a normative perspective, it's an extremely important thing. But how it gets developed when you're working for an international organization, there's only so much that is community driven. So that's when I started to kind of feel a little bit more inquisitive about what are the alternatives and how much should international organizations actually be involved in these spaces. Of course, I think there's a certain level of redistribution of wealth that I think it's wonderful that countries that have the finances, they direct and channel funding to countries that can use them. But how those funds are used, I started to just in general feel more uncomfortable with the development sector, because oftentimes those funds would be tied to specific funding goals that the organizations have and not necessarily what's always best and what's chosen by people. I think it was a couple of a mixed bag of experiences. Also, when I was in Argentina, I worked in an informal settlement with a youth program, and we were mostly volunteer run, and it was a great program for youth at risk in a community where teen pregnancies are really high and school drop-off rates are extremely high. So leading by example and being mentors and like engaging with youth was so powerful. But again, there needs to be a systemic shift, and not just and not sort of community-based approaches. Need to be also led by local people that have trust and build trust. And not to say that it was not a fulfilling experience. It was extremely fulfilling, and I'm still in touch with all of the families. And I overstayed my time in Argentina because I was so connected to the mission. And I think we didn't do harm. It's just I also felt that there's this could be a job that is hire somebody local rather than myself. So I think at some point, having the privilege to immigrate to Canada, I thought I should take my career path further north and see what I could do here. Although all of the experiences I've had have led me to the decisions I've made to be in the line of work that I'm now. But it also has been a bit of a learning that also, I think, turned me away from some of the more traditional international development work, which I still, I don't want to depreciate it. I think it's still extremely important. I just realized that perhaps I could contribute elsewhere.
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating, and I think really interesting to me as well, because as someone interested in international development, I often think about kind of the more problematic elements of what development actually means. And oftentimes I think it's gotten a bad rep, and rightly so, for being very top down and very imposed, and not bringing in the voices of community members that are really who we should be listening to. And so I think that's also something that I really love about LULA, is that it's really a tool and a methodology to bolster the voices of those who are in those communities and who are being affected by policies, and to allow them to have a say in what's happening around them. So I'm very, very excited to talk more about kind of the problems that LULA is seeking to address with its technology. And I think something really incredible is that it's also applied to global supply chains. And when you were talking about kind of positionality and being kind of someone from a developed country, or Canada, trying to act on this issue, how can we use kind of the technologies we have and the resources we have at hand to act on these issues? And with the connection of, brands who are based in North America and Europe, how do we leverage those connections and start acting from that source? So I think that's really a huge part of why we really wanted to speak to LULA, is because also, with COVID-19, we really saw the human consequences of the supply chain. We really became connected to kind of the humans at the end of the supply chain. Singapore, I think, became quite well known for its migrant worker hotspot in terms of COVID cases, something that, the world became really aware of, but has long been an issue there. And, in Canada, we saw the danger of COVID spread in meatpacking for workers. And so I think, COVID has been kind of a moment where we've really seen quite a shift in global attitudes and interest in people at the end of our supply chains, but also these issues are not specific to COVID, right? I think a lot of it comes from systemic factors that you mentioned, like, cramped housing conditions or a lack of social protections at the end of the day. So I guess kind of building on the mission of LULA, what kind of social issues or problem areas is LULA tackling with its worker voice and data analytics technology?
Yeah, that's a great preamble to the challenge. And I think, as you say, the COVID pandemic has only shed a spotlight on things that have already been known, and I think if anything, it has driven more organizations and companies to look into the well-being of essential workers. I think all of us knew that essential workers require the conditions in order to make a living and improve their livelihoods and do so safely. But I think in this context, it's only further amplified it. But with the LULA, apart from really engaging in collecting, remotely collecting feedback from workers during COVID-19, the mission for the company is to really look at how can we get to the most vulnerable populations that don't often get consulted, and do so in a way that's very safe for them. It's anonymous, confidential, and it also enables them to have a channel to voice their opinion more frequently, rather than what oftentimes is executed, which is, for example, they're consulted in a focus group during an audit, or they might be interviewed by an organization that is sent to do a study or an impact assessment or a social compliance audit once a year or once every 2 years. So instead of leveraging some of the more traditional face-to-face methods, which again are really important and they need to continue to happen, the crux of the challenge that LULA is trying to tackle is how can we actually open up this safe, anonymized digital line to workers continuously all the time, so that they feel that they have an uninterrupted path to voice their concerns. So if from the Sustainable Development Goals, the goal number 8.7 is the goal to end forced labor, modern slavery, and child labor in global supply chains. And that is the main Sustainable Development Goal that LULA is contributing to, because we really think that with better information for workers to access through whatever digital device that they have, and through this two-way channel through which they can voice their concerns, we'd be able to provide this anonymized data to companies who can then act and hopefully protect people's lives and their livelihoods, as well as their own reputation and their market value. And of course, to be compliant with both local and international standards on labor practices. The key aspect that we provide is ensuring that there's inclusivity in the type of channels that we open. So not only enabling an app or a website, but rather meeting people with the digital devices that they already have. So that would mean two-way text message channels or two-way voice recorded channels, which are also very inclusive and accessible to people whose both digital literacy and literacy are lower, to ensure that anybody can voice their opinion regardless of what language they speak, whether they're comfortable with a smartphone or WhatsApp, or whether they prefer to have an automated voice call or text message. We try to meet people where they're at, and then being able to aggregate that information and across languages and channels and regions to really provide the most granular information from on the ground that we can in a more frequent and continuous way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's really great to see just how adaptable, in this case, Ulula's technologies can be across, languages and geographies and channels, like you mentioned, because I think a lot of the issues within supply chains are not limited to a specific, sector or specific mode of production. Sometimes it's quite large scale. And so I'm just wondering, are there kind of specific areas in which Ulula conducts work in, or across kind of all the areas in which Ulula does deploy projects? Are there kind of consistent issues that Ulula is being used to respond to, or is it really unique?
Yeah, so there are a couple of different situations in which Ulula is very well fitted for. So, for example, the context of very remote work. So, for example, in the agricultural sector, where farmers and smallholder farmers and workers are in really remote conditions, where they might, not even have access to internet, and they also live on compounds that are provided by their employer. They don't have so many interactions with people in the towns, with people in the cities, and they don't have as many or as much access to support services as well. That is a condition in which I think Ulula can bring a lot of value, because even if there's not a great signal in the areas where they work, most workers know how to come to a tower and get some signal to be able to make a phone call to families. So we know that people are really resourceful, and if they do have some feedback to share or grievance to raise, that they would be able to find at least a bit of connectivity to share that. But in terms of other sectors, we work a lot in manufacturing. A lot of the factories where we work are very high tech, and places in Taiwan or China where every single worker has a smartphone and digital literacy is really high. But we are still able to achieve a certain sample of participation that perhaps an interview or on-site audit is not able to do. And to do that in a more frequent way. So doing follow-up quarterly surveys, or being able to open up an anonymized line through which workers can raise their concerns, especially in contexts where it might be taboo to do so, or maybe some topics would be very difficult for workers to raise to their supervisors, such as sexual harassment, or something that could be culturally a bit more tense and difficult for people to share. Those are also contexts where the tool can be of great benefit. And it really reduces the time of consultation. When an auditor or an impact assessment due diligence specialist is in a factory, they only can speak to a handful of workers during the time. Sometimes they can be picked by management. Management can see who are the workers that are being interviewed, which can cause a bit of fear of retaliation. Often auditors don't speak all of the languages of the migrant workers, so they're not able to consult with potentially who could be the most vulnerable workers in the workplace, who could be the international migrants. So it really is still pretty well fit for that context in manufacturing as well. But in general, it is very agile. So the problem that we try to solve is open up the lines of communication and amplifying these voices, and how we do it, where we do it, and how we configure both the technology and the methodology is very open. And this is where we really rely on local partners and experts to modify the content, to locally adapt it, and make sure it's available in all of the languages possible, so that we can make the system as accessible. And that gives us a lot of freedom. And that's been actually really kind of the fun parts of working, is every project is, brings something new to the table, which I think is important for us to keep in mind. We can standardize some things up to a point, but then beyond that, it could sometimes be even dangerous because we would be making assumptions. But if we're listening to the local partners and really understanding the local context, then we can create programs that really respond to it and would have a higher chance of being successful.
That's really interesting. And I think it also really addresses how technology in this case is kind of that pillar which enables a lot of the flexibility and the adaptability and the agility of LULA. So it's really, really great to see kind of how multidisciplinary collaboration, from people who have a background in human rights and a background in responsible sourcing and a background in engineering can really come together and kind of bring this really, really important solution and highly adaptable solution to light. And something that you said at the end there really, really captured my interest because you mentioned that it's really important to still, have standardization, but also to make sure that local context is respected and that every project kind of takes that into consideration. So I'm curious to know, from your experience deploying projects in different scenarios and different languages, different cultural contexts, what are some of the biggest takeaways that you've kind of come across, the best practices that you've come across in doing so?
Yeah, that's a really great question. One key learning in the last couple of years is that terminology really matters, especially when you have a simple 20-question survey instrument and you're trying to really get a lay of the land and do a bit of a diagnostic on where the potential forced labor or modern-day slavery risks in the workplace. The terminology used can be everything. It could miscommunicate a concept, but also it could help us win a bit of trust. Even though it's digital, even though it's remote, by using the right words, we can, especially what we would call like a proxy indicator, we can try to assess what could be a potential risk to an issue like forced labor without asking people if they are in a forced labor situation. So one key learning for me has definitely been, how do we wordsmith? How do we make sure that we have appropriate and adaptable and accessible language? And to do a lot of that, it's been talking to workers and it's been running surveys by local experts who then might have access to workers that they can validate the survey questionnaires with. One of the latest projects that we worked on last year with the Responsible Business Alliance was looking at a specific migration corridor of Vietnamese workers going to work in manufacturing in Taiwan. And before we deployed the survey instrument with the migrant workers, we worked with our local partner who was able to do focus groups with workers in Vietnam and really trying to get some feedback from them about the length of the survey, the terminology, how we ask the questions, how is the digital engagement experience. And that's extremely valuable feedback because then we are able to tailor the programs in a way that resonate with workers. So that's been one extremely important key learning. And the other one for me in the last couple of years when, the rise and slow decline of blockchain enthusiasm, it has been developing. And now also the key hype around machine learning and AI is of course at its peak. I think a key learning for me is to always try to understand how can technology be a conduit rather than the sole center and focus. So in the hype of blockchain, I think I joined every single client phone call I had. Clients would ask us if we're using blockchain, even though they had no idea how it works. And and even if they knew how it works, they wouldn't really know what kind of benefit it could bring to the type of work that we do. But I think that was a really key learning for us because ultimately a technology is just as good as its adaptation and application and its use case. So when it doesn't have a particular use case, you can really get excited about it. But if it's really difficult to implement and it really increases your cost, which makes projects inaccessible, or if it becomes so complex that the end user cannot understand what this is in the first place, it could actually hinder projects. So I think it's been interesting for us to consider and review and assess these new technologies while at the same time being champions for something that is simple, low tech, and that works. Of course, that's not to say that I don't get excited about potential machine learning, because the more machines can help predict things based on past patterns, the smarter the machine gets, and the better the data and the better the predictable analytics we can extract. But I think it's also been a learning to take a breath and not get overwhelmed by all of these things, because technology innovation will always be at a rapid pace. But it's how do we now, as social scientists, take that and say, okay, but how will this improve this one worker's experience? Or where could there be potential bias? Or how can we prevent over digitizing everything to the point where the worker gets questions that are not related to them, and then they think, wow, this has nothing to do with me. Why would I keep engaging? So that's been another really interesting learning for me, as innovation is running at a fast pace. Keeping realistic and really thinking about the use case, and of course not passing up opportunities when they come, but being more feet on the ground when it comes to this.
Yeah, I think that's honestly a really, really great point, because as you mentioned, the pace at which technology is moving, in which new technology is developing, can be very, very exciting and open up a lot of new doors. But at the same time, when you are acting on a specific issue and serving a specific stakeholder, it's really important to still center around the user experience and make sure that that main goal is always what's being served, as opposed to kind of the technology as a means and an ends. So I think that's a really, really valuable lesson for sure. And you also mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I'm curious to know if you have an example or a case study you can share of how Ulula's technology and also analytics drove impact for workers and for clients.
Yeah, I can share one example. Recently, in the time of COVID-19, an industry association and their member brands were really interested to understand how the pandemic has impacted workers' lives and livelihoods and well-being, and has it increased any risks of labor exploitation in their supply chains. So we launched this big project. We had close to more than 17,000 workers participate. And it was quite a big success. It was a difficult thing to deploy completely remotely in a really, really short amount of time, because of the urgency, and because of the risks that were brought on by the pandemic. And the reports were sent, and the suppliers, the factories, the brands, everybody received information, and some factories even are currently undergoing corrective action because of the results and the feedback that the workers have provided. But there was a really interesting case where a couple factories were really not happy with the results, and it was interesting. They reached out, and they engaged with their members, they engaged with the association, and we engaged with them, and we tried to really contextualize the results and share that these are workers' perceptions, and we have high statistical robustness in the data. But of course, if they might have a policy on grievance, but if workers have said that they don't know how to submit a grievance, and there's a disconnect, and that a company can learn from this. But just undergoing this engagement and dialogue, it could be seen as like, oh, this is bad, this is a risk, like people don't like the results. The results are not there to be liked or disliked. They're there. This is fact. This is what workers have shared. And now what you do with this information forward is what matters. Ignoring it would be worse. So I actually had a conversation with a couple of the key stakeholders of the project, saying, this is what you want. You want this kind of response from management. They were so, they really wanted to kind of share a rebuttal of the results that they provided, information about what they do and how they do it, and how they're trying to do this and trying to do that. But that is great. That is the kind of engagement that you want. It's a challenging time. Purchasing practices are not easy. Brands have their fair share of responsibility, because we all have heard the cases of orders being unpaid, orders being canceled in the middle of the pandemic after they've been shipped by factories. So there's that dynamic to always think about. So it's not really a bad actor, good actor kind of sector. So keeping that in mind, this is really the best outcome, where you have entities coming around the table and saying, let's take a look. What have workers said that they need changed? And what are some of the policies and codes of conduct that the factory has implemented that maybe don't seem to work, or workers just don't know about them, or they haven't actually been executed on. They might be a policy, but they're not actually executed. And that is the best case scenario. It's not easy because it's very a multi-stakeholder type of process, but it's also the most interesting because it is the one that will most likely lead to some change, because you have people's ears turned toward the voices of workers, and they're listening and they're trying to debate and trying to make a change. So that was just one key learning for me. Instead of being stressed about people combating the results or being unsatisfied, I was like, this is the best opportunity you'll ever get to talk to your suppliers about what this really means, and open up a conversation. So in terms of other kind of impact and case studies, we do work a lot in agriculture, and in the past year we've been developing a project with the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, and a processor and trader, and brands, and a local and an international NGO with local offices, to really look at how a tool like Ulula could be embedded with the producers rather than solely as a third-party kind of external mechanism of monitoring human rights issues in workplaces. So that's been a really interesting case study for us, because it's also extremely multi-stakeholder, lots of dynamics to consider, but also we've seen such innovative uptake by the local employers to use a tool like Ulula, because it does make their lives easier. And I think there is sometimes the assumption that producer suppliers are trying to always, cut corners, and, most of them, they have personal relationships with their workers. They want the product that they produce to be shipped out on time. They meet their buyer standards, and at the same time, not break any labor laws. So I think it has been really interesting to humanize that side of the story, working really closely and directly with producers, because I think in a lot of these global human rights risk monitoring projects, you can oftentimes lose that because you focus so much on what the brand wants, how the brand wants to reduce its reputational risk, that you forget that there's a complex process on the ground that you actually could be working side by side with to improve, so that everybody wins.
Yep, absolutely. And I think that's what the approach of LULA really enables, is that collaboration, and not even just, amplifying workers' voices, but also connecting that to the supplier, to, the factory manager level, and also to their buyers and the brands, to really make sure that that change is being followed up on and that the results are being followed up on. And I think even your point about, brands that actually want to take ownership and integrate those tools into their own operations, it's so encouraging to hear, because I think when you have that local ownership, that's when you ensure that, your project's not going to just run out at the end of its cycle. It's actually driving that continuous good practice down the line. So that's really, really, really encouraging to hear. And I think in the spirit of, collaboration, I'm also really aware that Ulula's team is incredibly, diverse across business development and programs and software development. And so I'm just curious, how does collaborating in such a multidisciplinary and diverse team help Ulula achieve its impacts? And kind of how has your experience been as somebody, who's more on the political economy and the human rights side? How have you found adapting to the, the different languages of the company, so to speak?
Yeah, there's two facets to that. There's the languages of culture, because as you know, Ulula's team most of us are based in North America, but none of us are actually North American. All of us come from other parts of the world, and we all bring with us certain cultural practices and communication standards. And I think that is quite marvelous, because also we serve clients and our end users, which are the workers and community members from all over the globe. So having a diverse understanding and a breadth and wealth of knowledge from the internal team at Ulula that comes from different industries and sectors and geographic regions. I think that's been one of the most interesting things working at Ulula, I think, and it definitely shows in the work that we do. But the second facet is, of course, the facet that we have social scientists, and then we have technologists. And it has been definitely a learning experience, both for the social science side as well as for the engineering side, to find ways to bridge those gaps and speak a language that is more common than diverse. And of course, there's days when people talk and I have no idea what they're really saying, but and I'm sure it's the other way around, and I have been told it's the other way around as well. But we work really hard to try to understand from the perspective of the user experience. So I think that is a common language we always try to speak. So even when we hear things of, for example, cron jobs, and it's like, how does that actually impact the worker's experience? And when an engineer explains it to me, like, oh, every couple of minutes, this is what happens in the system, and therefore it could cause a lag, it's very easy for me to understand. And I try to do the same thing when they share with us, like, oh, we built this, we built that. And I was like, wow, but put yourself in the shoes of the worker. If you are doing this right now and you got that kind of a message, what would you think? And then they're like, oh yeah, you're right. That wouldn't be so great. So I think our common language is the user experience of the worker. And I think if we always come back to that, we find a really productive way to innovate together and go forward. So I really enjoyed that process.
Yeah, I think that's really, really beautiful, actually, the whole focus on kind of, at the end of the day, we are all users to technology and we're all familiar with that kind of experience, and interacting with technology on that level is something that everybody can relate to. And I think, about the different languages of communication across, social sciences and engineering, that's something that, me as a social science student, I definitely see. And I think it's kind of built into the education system at the current stage that it's in right now. And I think that's also a huge part of what Global Spark wants to do, is to bridge that gap through, extracurriculars like the hackathon we host, but also through our in-course sort of teachings, where we try to bridge, engineering case studies with kind of social science applications and vice versa. So yeah, that's really, really great to know. And I think shifting gears a little bit too, to kind of just, while we're on the topic of, people and users, I think that the work of LULA is also taking place at a time where there's this huge trend towards, consumer awareness. I think social media has especially fueled that. Consumers now, I think, want to know where the cotton from their jeans come from. And a lot of people want to see companies take responsibility for the environmental and social consequences of their actions. And even governments have really started to pick this up too. So I'm quite curious to know, as someone who's been working in the responsible sourcing space during kind of the evolution of this in the past couple of years, what kind of changes have you seen in your time with Ulula in the willingness of companies and even governments in adopting these more worker-centered policies and solutions?
That's a great question. When I first joined Ulula, we were very focused on the mining sector, and one of the key values that we could bring was the ability to collect insight from community members that have been mostly impacted by extractive projects. So for them to be able to report issues of pollution, or for the company to be able to consult them and gather their feedback to gain and maintain that social license to operate. And then about 6 months after, there was a commodity crash, and all of the companies that we had been speaking to, and it was oftentimes the CSR, corporate social responsibility departments, all of their budgets were cut, their teams were cut, and it was really one of the first things to go. And that was very eye-opening, but at the same time, it motivated us to think about other alternative ways and pivot, and being a small social enterprise startup, we were able to do that. But it really did, for me, show the limitations of the traditional way we think about CSR, and how corporations like mining companies have embedded CSR within their policies and their strategies. It wasn't necessarily to change the way that they operate or to really operationalize consultation with key stakeholders and rights holders as part of their DNA, but it was rather kind of this offshoot, this separate department that worked on corporate social responsibility projects. And when we saw most of our projects cut, you're like, wow, but when things are tough, this is when the biggest risks happen. But given that CSR was not so integrated with operations, it really highlighted to me that we had so much more room to grow, because it was something that almost was seen as a pet project rather than necessarily something that's necessary and required. And fast forward 6 years later, I think we're in a very different place. Like, we actually speak to companies that don't have CSR departments and have departments that are called responsible sourcing, or they have departments called community engagement under sustainability, or, that it's really, I've seen a really big shift in corporations and how they think about the role of rights holders' feedback and information and value sharing, not as something that's a side thing like donating money, but rather as something that's integral to what they do. And that's been extremely encouraging. I say this with caution, because there's still a lot of companies that have so much to improve, and oil and gas and mining are still one of the more traditional that have the most room to grow. But as we see, the incorporation of more retail and online retail, and manufacturing is getting more and more global, and the pandemic has not necessarily slowed that down or changed any of it. And despite some political trends of more national production, let's say, for example, in the United States, in statistics, that hasn't actually, the global trade system hasn't actually changed. So I think that just highlights that it's even more important for us to really embed these kinds of human rights assessments and responsible sourcing certifications and due diligence processes as something that companies do regularly, rather than something that they're obliged to do, or that they do so that they can write a CSR report at the end of the year that shows that they care about the community or the planet. So I think that's been a shift. I think it's been more and more absorbed, and there's also still so much room to get better. And speaking from Canada here, the government hasn't yet implemented any legislation on how companies report on their human rights impacts in their global supply chains. And also, we do have some of the less transparent companies in the world. Like, there's so much more room to improve, but hopefully the trends are going in the right direction, with many governments taking up legislation on this, which I think in the end equalizes the playing field for companies. It gives them a clear marker of what they need to do, and it requires that they do it systemically rather than side projects. So we see this as an encouraging trend.
Yeah, that's really, really positive to hear, and I hope that continues as well. But I feel bad for being kind of the pessimist again here. But I'm also kind of curious to know, you mentioned some of the challenges that are still in the work that still needs to be done in this space. But I'm also wondering kind of currently, especially in terms of getting to hear worker voices specifically, do you face any sort of resistance or challenges in really pushing their voices to the front of, the sustainability and responsibility movement?
I think there's often a reluctance. A lot of actors can say, but how do I know that there's not that one angry worker who's going to want to try to really impact my results? Or sometimes we hear that, but 200 workers' responses out of 5,000 is just not enough for us to consider this information as credible. But if you actually contextualize that in how workers normally get consulted, this is still way ahead of the curve. Being able to consult a diversity of workers, more than a handful during a site audit, is still so much better than what we are currently doing. But then also the idea that this one person could game the system, or this one angry worker, how do you contextualize their feedback in the grand scheme of things? That's human nature, of course. Like, there will always be a margin of error. There'll always be certain attempts, although they're very few, and often they're completely not ingenuine, of some data that is for us to clean and filter out. But then extremes are there in any data set, and that's normal. This is why you look at averages. This is why you could look at different types of methodologies for, whether it's a median or a different analysis for you to really contextualize extremes. It still provides a story. We're humans. One day you could feel really, really good about your supervisor, and the next day you could feel kind of bad about them. And it really matters which day we ask you. So somehow there has been a bit of pushback that I've seen, where the data's credibility or integrity gets questioned. But It's oftentimes, it also oftentimes comes a place of fear, because I don't think that we are used to radical transparency. And even though we understand that there's always going to be people who have very strong feelings about one topic or another, we know that the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. So if you were to look at the majority of that population, you see quite a nuanced situation. But somehow when it comes to getting a dashboard with data, you want like a certain perfection to it. And I think it's been our job to try to dispel that, because ultimately we're collecting human feedback and it's workers' perceptions. And we try really hard to socialize that aspect, that unlike collecting satellite imagery of percent or meters squared that have gone into deforestation, which is a super cool innovation that I've been following. But that is a hard science. When it comes to people's feelings, it's obviously a different mixed bag. So we have to approach it from that perspective when we read the data. And yeah, so that's been a bit of a challenge in socializing that aspect, to then be able to get to a more productive conversation with our clients and their suppliers about, okay, so now what do we do? This is what workers are sharing. These seem to be priorities. What would be the best next steps in a corrective action plan or some remediation that could help boost the workers' perception next time that we contact them again. So I think that's been an interesting. It's not a negative challenge, because I find it's one that is natural, because we're threading ground that hasn't really been walked on too much. When you're changing little things in the audit program, it's accepted because it's been around for so long. But when you're talking about worker voice data solutions, it's something that hasn't been around for that long. So every new little thing is actually an opportunity to grow and for us to figure out where we stand as a company. And then one more challenge I will bring up, which is more systemic, comes down to resources. We do find a lot of companies really eager to do more, but because this is, again, a new field and it's not something that's easily socialized with the C-suite when it comes to sustainability metrics, because ESG, the environmental social governance risk metrics, often have focused on the environmental, which is easier to measure, and the governance, which is, again, policies, procedures. So the S has been that fuzzy aspect that we just haven't figured out great ways of measuring. So I think that has led to smaller budgets on social impact measurement in companies. But that is also changing. We're seeing more and more of our partners coming to us and saying, give me this proposal so we could try this and try that, so I can try to socialize it with my superiors to be able to secure funding for next year. And we're seeing a lot of entrepreneurs moving things within corporations, which has been also refreshing. I think when I worked in the nonprofit sector, I thought of the corporation as one big corporation rather than a corporation made up of many, many people, and a certain percentage of them actually people that I would, go have coffee with, and people that have the same value systems as myself. So I think that has also given me more hope that there are this challenge of resources and funding for these kinds of projects is soon hopefully going to be shifting in a better direction.
Yeah, I love that term, baby people, in the organization. I think it's so true. And it's really something I think we're taught in social science too, is to accept that sometimes things are fuzzy. There's no definite answer or stance that anybody has. It's really a conversation, and kind of at any point, the aggregate of the voices is how change gets shifted in a certain direction or another. So I think the work that LULA is doing in both pioneering and kind of being the entrepreneurs and kind of the space outside of the companies, pushing for worker voices to be recognized and pushing for people to trust this data and trust that people's perceptions are just as valuable as, any other more, quote unquote, objective measures. If there can even be, quite very objective ways of knowing other things, I think it's really, really awesome. And it's great to see that there are also champions in organizations who are pushing for change and pushing for that as well. And I think that also is really great advice for people who, are interested in pushing the bounds of, social entrepreneurship and development and kind of responsibility, because, it is you will face pushback. You will face, needing to convince people to trust what you're doing and to trust the process and socialize those ideas. So I think that's really a good segue into kind of the next concluding sort of portion of our conversation, because I just wanted to have your thoughts and advice for our listeners out there. Many of them are aspiring entrepreneurs, social change makers, and forward-thinking students who are really looking for ways to improve the world through, collaborating between different sectors and with different actors and using technology for good. So I guess the first thing that you already touched on a bit is kind of what are some trends in the intersection of technology and human rights that you think we should watch out for, or something that you've been really personally invested in?
Yeah, I think one great aspect is that there's so many organizations and innovations popping up around the world. And one of the great trends that I've noticed and I really look forward to is collaboration. And I think because we work with technologies, there is a potential for interoperability. So we could plug into an existing system, or we could have two new innovations pushing data to each other and being able to triangulate information to validate, verify, provide more context. So that is a trend I've really enjoyed observing, and also really pushing for and advocating for with Ulula, as well as we keep growing our list of partners and complementary technological tools that focus on either a similar thing or maybe a complementary thing. So I mentioned the satellite imagery innovations where, just recently I was watching that the Global Fisheries Watch produced a tool where they're able to use satellite imagery to predict which fishing vessels might have a higher propensity or higher risk of using forced labor. Using simply satellite imagery, they've developed 27 variables that they're looking at, and they've had a really great success rate of 90%. And that is just such a neat tool that looks at the similar problem from a different lens and different data set. Now to contextualize further, to be able to verify from the ground, there's such a great opportunity for Ulula to collaborate with entities like these, because then we would know potentially where to dive in further to really look at the depth and breadth of the issue after having prioritized specific areas, for example, collecting satellite imagery. And so, yeah, that's one trend that I really enjoy, is technology enables that. It enables the communication of information between different platforms. And there is a general understanding that we should not be reinventing the tool all the time, but rather there's much more growth potential and impact potential if we collaborate. Then I also noticed that there's trends in artificial intelligence that are really interesting, but I think time will tell of how a system needs so much more data for something like that to work and be of value. So I'm excited to see where that could take the field of worker-centric technology design in the future.
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating, because it also goes back to what you were talking about earlier about applying the technology to the issue area and not trying to force kind of a new technology onto an issue area that you're already, might be working in or are familiar in. So I think, even what you mentioned about satellite imagery, right? That's a technology that's been around for so long, obviously lots of new developments, but it's not, they didn't have to do quantum physics. I don't know, I'm a social science student, so to do that, right? So I think that's really, really great. So, and it also is very encouraging to people, and I think current students, is that the things that, we're learning about now, the things that we have access to now, they're just waiting to be applied to something, as long as you're very aware of, the issue and how the technology can be used to help it, rather than to, be forced onto it. So I think that's really, really awesome. And I guess the other thing I wanted to ask you is whether you had any words of advice or encouragement for students looking to pursue a career at the intersection of tech and global development, regardless of what their current academic background is now.
Yeah. My one word of advice would be don't limit yourself. I think it's really a learning journey until you get to a career or a topic that you realize you're really, really passionate about. And even if everything that preceded that doesn't necessarily align, you probably will gain a ton of experience, a ton of learning that is transferable. So it's especially now tough looking for jobs during a pandemic. We don't have face-to-face interactions where you get to build relationships that could be really helpful in landing on a great career you're passionate about. I would say try different things. Don't be afraid of even going into the corporate environment, because although in some experiences it might be disenchanting and it might be very bureaucratic, I've learned that there's quite an interesting entrepreneurship movement within organizations, especially that are looking at the intersection of tech and human rights or social impact. And then I think it's also taking the pressure off that first job does not have to be the perfect job that lands you to the next perfect job for you to get to your end goal. But take the pressure off of that. I know that after university, I took up a teaching job just to get to Asia, because I had spent some time there before. I wanted to go back to Southeast Asia, and the easiest way for me to get a Thai work visa was to be a teacher at a university. And of course, on the side between teaching, I did lots of things that I was very passionate about in the space of human rights and migration. But at the same time, it was an extremely important experience to be able to speak in front of hundreds of students, articulate my ideas, be patient, work with people of completely different culture. And if I even think about that time, it was extremely beneficial to me in my personal and professional growth. And even though it had nothing to do with responsible sourcing and fair global trade, I know I learned a lot of skills that I have been able to take with me in all of my future jobs. So I would recommend, test different things, try different things. Nothing is forever. You can always shift and move. And as long as you have your heart set on something that sits in the space of contributing to a societal or environmental good, you're going to land in a job that you enjoy. The path might not be so straight from point A to point B, but rather it might take lots of random curves and twists. And who knows what you'll find along the way.
That's very reassuring to hear as someone who's graduating very soon. And I think it's been so wonderful just hearing about your story and kind of how you went from your experiences in totally different sectors to kind of your work with the LULA now, and also learning about how you managed to bring about collaboration not only within the work that you do with the LULA, but also the work that LULA projects onto the whole sector of responsible sourcing and human rights. And so I'm very excited to continue to follow what LULA is up to, and I'd like to thank you so much on behalf of everybody at Global Spark for taking the time to chat with us today, Vera.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
And that's a wrap on this episode. We'll be back soon with a different guest exploring a new avenue in the world of social impact, global problem solving, and multidisciplinary collaboration. But don't you worry about missing out. We will CC you on it.
The CC World podcast is produced and edited by Maurice Huang and Atharva Agrawal. Content creation is undertaken by Huan Zhang, Logan Keeler, and Annie Zhu. And the music is created by Gent Zapluja. You can find more CC World episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and YouTube. Remember to follow us on social media at Global Spark to get updates on future events and content. And visit our website at globalspark.world for more information. Once again, thanks for listening to CC World, and we'll see you on the next episode.